All right, I think that it's time. Hey everybody, this is the third installation of Rock and Roll High School. I'm so happy to see everyone here again. Again, I'd like to do tiny housekeeping before we start. I have been recording what's been happening. So if you don't want to be recorded, please turn your video off. If you're fine with like having a tiny screen in the corner, totally fine. Leave your video on. That's pretty much it, I believe. I don't have anything else that I need to bring up right now. And we're going to start with Felix. Felix is going to be doing a presentation on North African punk and DIY, and we're going to be doing it in two parts now. So the first part is tonight, and then the second part will be on April 4th. So without further ado, Felix.
Okay, thank you so much for having me and for hosting this project, Sasha. Let's get started. Can you folks see my screen okay? Yeah. All right. All right, so my name is Felix Lahbabi Granger. I use they, them pronouns. Today, I'm going to be talking about DIY and punk-adjacent music in North Africa. For the purposes of this project, I'm going to be talking about the Maghreb, which is just an Arabic term for all of the land in North Africa west of Egypt. A little personal background. I am first-generation Canadian on my mom's side. My mom immigrated to Canada from Morocco in the 70s, and I'd just like to give a big shout out to her for helping me with pronunciation of a lot of the words and names, and for translating a few things for me, as well as inspiring this project with her knowledge and lived experience. So without further ado, let's get into it. In the presentation to follow, I'm going to be talking about how music in the Maghreb is made with an ethos very similar to punk in our own communities in North America, through a tradition of protest music, both in more traditional and more Western influenced forms of music since the 70s, as well as a tradition of making and distributing music on a small scale through underground networks and often with minimal resources to work with. So to begin, I'm going to talk about contemporary punk and metal. Just right off the bat, I would like to highly recommend anyone who doesn't already know about it to check out A World Divided Tapes, based in Montreal. They are a fantastic resource. They have put out many, the majority of the punk releases that I'm going to be talking about, and they're going to be putting out more. And they've done a great job in making a lot of this music more accessible to a worldwide audience. So I just, big ups for that. First band I'm going to talk about is Takbir from Morocco, from Tangier. Their name means to glorify God. Their demo this year, pictured on the far left of the screen, is probably my favorite overall punk release in general this year so far. It has fast and tight songwriting, prominent chorus pedal, and would fit alongside like contemporary and recent North American hardcore bands like Exit Order extremely well. For a little bit of cultural context, the second track on their demo is called Aisha Kandisha, and that is in reference to a female Moroccan spirit, or jinn, a female spirit with hoofed legs that lives near bodies of water, and it is said to attract men with her beauty and drive them insane or kill them, as well as possess people and make them speak like animals, and cause infertility in women. And this spirit, Aisha Kandisha, is said to be based on historical fact of a woman in the 18th century in Morocco who would, according to folklore, seduce Portuguese colonial soldiers and lure them to a secluded location where they would be ambushed and killed by Moroccan freedom fighters. Next, I'm going to talk about Democracia from Algeria, which translates to Democrat shit. They are probably the longest running North African punk band that you can find right now. They have also had their stuff put out through World Divided Tapes. They play fast and crusty hardcore, and they've even had some of their music put out on an international compilation tape done by Maximum Rock and Roll, which I'm going to be sharing a playlist of music that I'm talking about today in the chat afterwards. But I couldn't find the Maximum Rock and Roll comp with a bunch of them and a bunch of other just, non-North American, European hardcore punk bands. So if anyone knows where that is or like can find it on Soulseek, please hit me up. Another really cool hardcore punk band from North Africa right now is Mara Borkan, which means volcano woman. They're an all-female band from Tunisia that plays like hardcore metal fusion music, kind of similar to Gizm or something like that. Zlakwela Mout is a skate punk band from Morocco, and Jnouj is a metalcore band from Tunisia. They play music that sounds like Meshuggah, like combined with faster hardcore punk. And their tape is pictured on the far right of the screen, and you can see that on their tape cover they have a woman dressed in traditional indigenous North African garb, as well as having traditional face tattoos. And they also have indigenous script on the spine of their tape. So next, we're going to be talking about indigenous identities in North Africa and how that intersects with a lot of the music that I'm going to be talking about. So the main indigenous language or language group in North Africa that can be traced back thousands of years pre-Arab conquest and Islamization in pre-medieval times is Tamazight, also commonly known as Berber. The term Berber comes from the Greek barbaros, which was just used it means barbarian, and it was just used to describe any person who didn't speak Greek. But when the Romans and the Ottomans and Arabs got, attempted to conquer peoples in North Africa, they would call them Berbers, just as a general catch-all term for the people who inhabited those lands. So, Imaziren is the proper plural word for Berbers. Amazigh is singular, Tamazight is the name of the language group, and Tifina is the script. And so all North African countries during the scramble for Africa were colonized by the vast majority of them by France. Libya was colonized by Italy, and parts of northern Morocco as well as Western Sahara was colonized by Spain. And so all of these countries that I've mentioned can be characterized by a mix of indigenous culture and Arab culture, and as well as European culture for those reasons. All of the most commonly spoken dialects, if you're not just speaking, a European language, or you're not just speaking a pure indigenous dialect, the most common dialects are Arabic mixed with Tamazight and the European language of whatever colonizer was in that region. So in colonial times, these European empires would use the linguistic and cultural differences between Arab and Imaziren tribes to divide them and conquer them. And they would favor one group over another, providing one with certain opportunities or privileges, and causing just further dissent between, the people who they were exploiting. And so after all of the countries in North Africa gained independence through the 50s to the 70s, through a series of wars and protests, in response to the policies of divide and conquer that colonial governments had, all of the governments in the Maghreb, to some degree, pursued a policy of cultural Arabization. So they banned the teaching of Tamazight. They banned the naming of children with indigenous names. In some cases, arresting or disappearing indigenous activists. In one of the most extreme cases, in Gaddafi's Libya, he believed that Berber identity, indigenous identity, was purely a construct of Western colonialism put in place to divide Libya. And he is quoted as saying to community leaders in 2007, "You can call yourselves whatever you want inside your homes, Berbers, children of Satan, whatever, but you are only Libyans when you leave your homes." In 2012, a bill entered Moroccan parliament making Tamazight an official language, which was only fully ratified in 2019. In 2016, Algeria declared Tamazight an official but not a national language. And in that same year, Morocco lifted the ban on Tamazight names. So there's been a lot of progress in the past few years, and a lot of amazing work being done by people to keep these cultures alive and to keep them recognized. But there are still difficulties in daily practice that aren't reflected by government policy, such as trying to get your ID card in Tamazight, or Tamazight only being taught in certain schools, and people being intimidated at hospitals not to give their children Tamazight names, even though the ban has been lifted. So in practice, there is still a stigma, unfortunately. So with all of that in consideration, we can take a look at some Moroccan and Algerian black metal bands and how they've incorporated indigenous identity into their music. So as you might notice that there is indigenous script on all of these album covers. All of these bands, Tagat, Ahake and Bror, and Tadart from Algeria, all of them have purely Tamazight band names and lyrics. And most of these releases came out in the mid-2000s, before the Arab Spring and before the resurgence of indigenous politics in North Africa. And while black metal is often associated, for good reason, with white nationalism, especially in Europe, it's interesting to see that flipped on its head and use this extreme music as a tool for indigenous resurgence in an underground context. So while punk and black metal and other forms of Western influenced outsider music are very cool to look at and see what they've created in North Africa, it is also something that has a very limited audience. These bands have next to no place to play most of the time. If it is, it's to very small crowds. So next we're going to be talking about some more traditional forms of music in North Africa and what they have in common with a punk ethic that we are familiar with here in North America. So talking about desert blues, it's essentially guitar music at its core. In some of these bands like Tinari Wen, Terakaft, you have Madou Mokhtar, you have up to 6 or 7 guitar players occasionally, along with vocalists and traditional rhythm instruments. It's music that is by and large made and distributed on a very small scale and often kept underground just by virtue of the technology that's available. Many recordings by bands like Group Inarain and early recordings by Tinari Wen and Madou Mokhtar are extremely raw rock and roll music. Cell phones are widely in use in this underground network, and people trade music files by sharing SIM cards and over Bluetooth connections, sharing MP3s. And so this music, without any kind of Western release or record label or even computers in some cases, this music manages to travel across a continent purely by this underground network of sort of trading tracks on cell phones. And this to me, it's very reminiscent of 80s punk and metal tape dubbing culture, where people would dub a cassette tape, lend it to their friend, they would dub a shittier version of it, and it would just go so on and so on, and people would share music that way before the internet. So Sahel Sounds was a project started by Portland music archivist Christopher Kirkley, and he went to the Sahara and saved songs from these SIM cards to his laptop. And in 2010, he put out a tape, the first volume of music from Saharan cell phones. This got ripped to the internet and got circulated, got sampled by Death Grips, and a lot of people found out about it that way. And the West really got its first taste of this underground network that you had no way to hear otherwise. So, yeah, that about lays the groundwork for that underground network that I wanted to talk about. And now, if you look at the album cover on the far left of this slide, the Tera Kaft album, Aratan and Azawad. Azawad, that album title means Sons of Azawad. Azawad being a proposed independent Tuareg state in northern Mali. So to get more into that and the history of the indigenous Tuareg people and the music that is made in their communities and their conflict with the Mali central government, we are going to move on to Tinari Wen and talk about that in a little more detail. So Tinari Wen, you might have heard of them. They have toured worldwide, and they're probably, aside from Madhu Mokhtar, the most widely known band to have come out of this circuit. They have described themselves as military artists, and its members have participated in fighting against the Malian government during the 1990s, and they were trained along with many other disenfranchised Tuareg youth by Gaddafi's military in the 80s to form a kind of mercenary army after having been displaced by successive droughts and a lack of employment opportunities and colonial borders disrupting their traditionally free, nomadic, pastoral way of life, which became increasingly difficult. One of Tinari Wen's founding members, Ibrahim al-Habib, witnessed his parents executed by Malian soldiers at the age of 4 for the crime of providing food to rebels. He, when he was a child, built his own guitar out of a stick, a jerry can, and bicycle brake wire. And Tinari Wen, in their early days, would play occasional shows in between fighting the Malian government forces in the 90s, including playing a show in 1990 in a bush camp the night before an attack on a police outpost, which kicked off the 1990s conflict. They were inspired by Western African music like Ali Farka Touré, Western rock and pop and blues music, and traditional music, as well as Moroccan protest folk music, such as the band Nes El Hriwain, who song Fein Radi Bia Huya, roughly translated to Brother, Where Are We? Or Brother, Where Are We Going? Was sort of the North African equivalent in the 70s of Marvin Gaye's What's Going On? And it was released in a particularly tumultuous political time in Morocco in the 1970s that were known as the Lead Years, in a time when King Hassan was often being targeted for assassination and people were being disappeared by secret police. So if we look at the lyrics from their song 63, 63 has gone but will return. Those days have left their traces. They murdered the old folk and a child just born. They swooped down to the pastures and wiped out the cattle. 63 is gone but will return. We can see kind of the cyclical nature of these conflicts. In 1963 and 1964, there was the first Tuareg rebellion against the Malian central government, who, the nomadic Tuareg people, many of them just viewed the Malian government, as just replacing the French Empire, as just another faraway ruler that didn't particularly care for them or provide any opportunities and safety for their people. Conflict broke out again in the 90s and in 2007, and most recently in 2012. Currently, there's a stalemate and negotiations taking place between leaders for an independent Tuareg state known as the MNLA, the National Movement for the Liberation of Azawad, and the Malian government. Some of Tinariwen's lyrics definitely directly are calling for people to stand up and fight, like in their song Shet Bograsa. We liberate our village with old rifles, with knives and stones, otherwise we'll all die together. But I think it would be a mistake to just characterize their music purely as nationalist. They're also very critical of their own people in their lyrics. Like in the song Matajem Yinimixan, Why All This Hate? There's the lyric, you who neither resemble a Westerner nor an Arab, your faith in the tribes blinds you to the truth. And again, in Imidiwan Matenam, translates to, what have you got to say, my friends? There's the lyric, we live in ignorance and it holds all of the power. And in other songs like Tanale Shegret, they touch on the confusion of war and if it will even bring about a just world. There's the lyric, the revolution is a long thread, easy to twist, hard to stretch. So just touching again on Tina Liwen's thoughts on the merits of revolution in the first place, I'd like to take a look at their lyric from Imi Diwan Afrik Temdam, my friends from all over Africa. I have a question which torments my soul, my friends. Is the revolution like those trees whose branches will grow if we water them? I have lived with this obsession for 10 years. I have come among brothers. My friends, what do you think? These men have been living with oppression since the day of their birth. They cannot make the trees grow with their water. So at this point in their lives, Tinari Wen, whose founding members are in their 60s, are more focused on humanitarian aid than fighting, and certainly the rebellions that they have participated in are an emotionally very tough spot, and I don't think they seek to glorify it at all. But at the same time, they have not retired by any means, and they have insisted in interviews that if peace cannot work, then they will return to fighting. So that concludes part one of my presentation. On April 4th, I'm going to be talking about the Western Sahara conflict and Sahrawi rebel music. And yeah, thank you so much for listening. I'm going to share a little playlist in the chat with you folks for anyone who is interested. And I'll hopefully see you next time for part two. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Felix. Okay, that was that was very sick. I'm very excited for part two as well. I believe, given the information that I was just told, we will do a little switch up, and that Meredith will now be presenting. Is that's still true? Okay, very sick. So give me 1 second, and I'll cue up Meredith's video. Uh-oh, why do I have so many things open? Wait. Cool.
Sorry. So guys, I'm gonna try to do this from my computer. We were having some issues with it before. I am completely technically a little inept, so we're gonna give this a go. Let me know if this works, if you can hear things, if you can see the video. If not, we will try another route and we will maybe have to try to figure something else out. Thank you. Let's see. Hi friends, my name's Meredith. Anybody who knows me probably knows I'm a bit annoyingly obsessed with pop music, and they've probably had me talk their ear off about why they should listen to like the new Kylie Minogue or Kylie Rae Jepsen album, but I promise that's not all I'm into. So I wanted to kind of talk about a brief history of sort of like canon 70s and 80s punk, like adjacent, like synth punk adjacent, labels and bands that came from those labels, and then go into talking actually about some of these bands that are from the same eras, but
okay, I'm going to fast forward to where we're at. It seems like it's working for most people. Tell me if not.
Either in a studio
Good.
or owned by like a major label or a studio, make you let you make bleep loops. It wasn't really something that was like super accessible to people. But then there's kind of a shift, I would say, in the early mid 70s, Cabaret Voltaire forming in 1973. You've got Throbbing Gristle forming in 1975. These are, I think, two kind of like iconic industrial electronic type bands. Both of them who were like making their own like tape loops that had like oscillators and kind of like making sense out of anything that they could get their hands on that was like had to do with electronics. And I think that was a huge inspiration for a lot of people, specifically like within the punk scene, because this was still like very much punk stuff, that they kind of like started to garner a lot of interest in electronic related stuff. And then another thing that happened a little later on, but like towards, I would say like, I think it's the late 70s or the early 80s, you see synths like the 80s Korg and like ARP synths, like ARP synths, costing the same as guitars. So this kind of really changed the game for a lot of people, and I think allowed a lot of exploration and the development of a lot of different kinds of, I guess, like electronic genres. So around this time, I would say there's three labels that kind of like built the sound as to like what we know is more like alternative electronic synth type music. Obviously there's so much more. If I had all night, I would be jumping into that. The first I would say is Daniel Miller of the Normal and Silicon Teens, responsible for synth bangers such as TVOD and Warm Leatherette. Silicon Teens did that great cover of Memphis, Tennessee, if you're familiar with it. He founded Mute Records in 1978. Mute was responsible for releasing bands such as Nights Are Up, Robert Rental, Fat Gadget, and Frank Toby's other related projects. Depeche Mode's projects such as Yazoo and Erasure. So that was a really huge label starting in the UK. Another UK label that actually also started in 1978 was Factory Records. They were responsible for putting out bands like Joy Division, New Order, DAF, Durutti Columns, Section 25, ESG, and Domino. So all things that I think were like very much at the time on the alternative side of things and like remaining punk, or only punks were interested in it. It was kind of like not really something that was being wildly played on the radio. Like people might go dancing to it, but as like things went on, like I would say that a lot of these bands, like specifically if you're looking at like New Order, Depeche Mode, and that kind of related stuff, like kind of just became radio pop. And I think this is around a time when like lots of punk sort of started to not care as much about this kind of music, and sort of see it as like something that was soft, or, you know, have a shift back to the guitar related stuff. So another label that popped up across the pond in the States was Wax Tracks, sorry. So it started in Denver in the mid 70s. I'm sure if the date had actually opened, but it really blew up after having the Ramones come and play their first show in Denver in 1977, and they just like repped the store super hard and were saying that it's like the best record store they'd ever been to. And after that, Wax Tracks just kind of blew up. And then the owners of Wax Tracks, who were a couple, Jim and Dan, decided to actually relocate to Chicago in 1978. Around the same time, there was just like so much interest in the stuff they were putting out that they decided to start their own label. So this included bands like Ministry, Front 242, and then Front 242 and Ministry's kind of like partner band, The Revolting Cocks, so much other stuff. Give it a Google if you want. I mean, I would say that Wax Tracks' catalog has like some of the best kind of like hard dance stuff that came out between like the 80s and the 90s. So I'm gonna play a little clip of bands from Factory, Wax Tracks, and Mute just to kind of get a sense of the vibe.
Hear the crushing steel, feel the steering wheel, warm, leatherette, warm, leatherette, warm, leatherette, warm, leatherette.
Wow, that was great. I miss shows, don't you? So around the 90s, it was actually 1992, you start to see the collapse of a lot of these labels. Either a lot of their main performers are getting a lot of like major label attention and are leaving the label to get more money, get better deals, whatever. And the labels are also receiving a lot of pressure from these other major labels to be bought out. Jim and Danny of Wax Tracks, Jim actually passed away, and then I think Danny just kind of gave up and sold the label to TBT. There's actually a really good documentary on Wax Tracks. It's called Wax Tracks Industrial Accident. I highly recommend it. And then Factory was bought out by London Records, and Mute is now, I'm not sure exactly the history of it, but it's now owned by EMI and Sony. So I think a lot of people just kind of felt that either these bands were like selling out, they were constantly like recreating their sounds, or it just wasn't what it was anymore. It kind of lost all of the DIY ethos that it was founded on. And I think that's sort of when a lot of people started losing interest in the genre or looking elsewhere for this kind of music. So I would say that's kind of like the end of this section, but I thought it was worth noting because a lot of the bands that I'm going to be talking about later were actually completely inspired by these bands, actually might have been part of the same scenes, or were maybe hoping to get the same kind of attention that they were. And I think it was worth bringing up just to sort of see sort of like what the vibe was and what the scene was like at the time. I feel like I would be doing a disservice to everybody here and synths in general if I didn't talk about synth punk. I'll get back to the pop stuff a bit later, but this kind of like small genre, I would say, of synth punk, I feel like never became a huge thing because this like kind of synth music is either kind of too pop for punk or too punk for pop, and it sort of just exists within this like purgatory of people either being like embarrassed to be into it or like not sure about it. But I think there's some really great bands that came out of this, notably like the Screamers, Pink Section, Inflatable Boy Clams, Dow Jones and the Industrials, the Dancing Cigarettes, Liquid, Nervous Gender, the Units. So I'm going to play a little clip of a few of these bands just over time. So here I go.
Try to keep myself sane. That means I try to be hygienic. Do you know what I mean? Oh, yes. I want to do some dance. I want to do some dance. I want to do some dance. Dance! I'm trying to be a musician.
Great. So if you're wondering about the drummer of Nervous Gender, he's actually 8-year-old boy Sven Pfeiffer, who replaced the Germs drummer Don Bowles in 1981. Unfortunately, Sven's mother took him back to Germany, ending his career with the band. But I'd say Sven is probably my biggest inspiration for my drumming with Beep Test. So God bless. Thankfully, I do feel like there has been kind of like a reemergence of synth punk over the last few years, which I really appreciate and hope to see more of. You know, bands like Lotion, Plastic, ISS, even like The Mall really do give me hope that like we're going to be seeing more bands like this, which makes me really excited. Also, maybe we should just be doing like a whole synth punk series. Connor, I'm looking at you if you want to collab. So anyways, I guess back to kind of the pop programming. What I really wanted to focus on and what inspired me for kind of doing this is all of these bands that have come up over the last, like, I would say 10, 15 years or so. Let's say like the Oppenheimer Analysis, Lives of Angels, Solid Space, 11 Pond, things that like, one, I feel like are sort of like Spotify algorithm, which I find is really interesting and is dictating a lot of people's tastes, but also it's just like pop music the punks are kind of listening to and are really drawn towards. But I think what a lot of people don't realize about these bands is that they were never popular when they were actually making their music. And the reason that they've had any sort of like resurgence in the last few years has been because of like, one, like people maintaining their collections, but it's actually just been through re-releases. So there's a few labels right now that are really responsible for this. I would say there's Minimal Waves, which is a huge one, who actually kind of coined the term minimal wave as a combination of minimal synth and cold wave. And that's put on by Veronica Vesca out of New York, who's a DJ. She actually has just been always like cataloging and archiving like all kinds of like rare synth dance kind of stuff that is a little bit on the weirder side. And she was finding when she was DJing, she was playing Devil's Dancers by Oppenheimer Analysis. I'm sure you've heard of it. If not, give it a listen after this. But she was like, everybody freaks out when I play this song. Like, it should be repressed because all I know is that it's like on a cassette and people don't really have access to it. So repressed this Oppenheimer Analysis record. Really strange too, because the two guys who were in the band, one of them is a nuclear weapons specialist now, and the other one is a general practitioner. So like, you know, people change. But I think what's really cool is the like minimal wave thing and all of the bands that have come out of their catalog is really thanks to people archiving their stuff and saving zines, tapes, magazines from that decade, because so many of these bands like really weren't getting any attention. Some of them had never played a show. When I was looking for footage for like the video that I'm going to play later, like most of my favorite bands like from this kind of scene have nothing. Like they started playing live shows in like 2012 or 2014 when people started paying more attention to them. So once again, like with what Sasha and Connor were saying last week, like save your stuff, because you never know when there's going to be like a need for the kind of music we're listening to right now. And, you know, it could get re-released like 20, 30, 40 years down the road and like kind of like re-inspire a whole new genre of music. So yeah, another record label that's putting out some really cool stuff right now is Dark Entries. I'm sure if you're into this stuff, you're well aware of their catalog or probably like own a few of their represses. But I highly suggest like browsing both of these labels, like archives and catalogs. And I would say like, you know, 9 out of 10 of the artists like completely fuck. So I'm going to play a video of sort of like what I'm talking about when I'm talking about this kind of music, and then I'll bring up sort of some of these other bands that I wasn't able to find footage of, and yeah, here we go.
When I was playing in Bound, the problem, you know, is that we were just trying to reproduce what has been already made, you know. Synthesizer was different because what I was able to do with synthesizers was things that I was not hearing on the radio or elsewhere. Some machines, you know, like the 808 or 909, they have a really strong personality. So when you are using it, I mean, from a user to another user, the machine is running the music more maybe than the musician. When the track was recorded, was finished, and I was going for another one. Because there is no way to save anything. You are turning the band pots, you are turning the buttons, you are going from one machine to another, the recorder is running, and when it's finished, it's finished. That was the difference regarding the music that was made this time.
Niños y las niñas van andando juntos, fuman cigarrillos, a veces siguen. Los sonidos gentes fumarán cigarrillos, jugarán con bombas a hidrógeno. Everyone is standing all around. You must not let me anymore around. You're too many left here. So don't let my en la espalda de un esclavo, enterrado hace 1000 años, el río de la espada, coloca y déjala a los vientos, de los ojos de una joven, tan hermosa como extraña, en las arenas desiertas y el aullido del chacal, la marca de nubes, la cosa y me persigue, la marca de nubes, ok, pero chumu. They got a clouds up in the treetops, yeah. You're in the army now. 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 Détache mes pensées dans un flot de murmures vers les terres éclatées du repos éternel. La machine à rêver a saoulé le réel, dépassant l'immortel via la réalité. La machine à rêver a dépassé le temps, saluant l'éternel fait du pays des dieux. I want to be in a tree, watching you, watching trees, memories of the tree, watching you, watching me.
So at the start of the video, you had the person responsible for an Eternam Vale kind of just talking about like the minimal synth process and how at a point like everything, I mean, obviously still now can like was totally done in your bedroom. And I think that was obviously really thanks to sort of like technological developments. But I think that's also the reason why a lot of this stuff really was like kept in the dark. It was just like tape trading with friends and like it being like a hobby thing. A lot of these artists like had other things going on in their lives and like similar to a lot of us just like have bands on the side or whatever. But I think it's really wonderful that they've all been like, it was so great, like looking through, trying to find footage and like watching videos of like these people, like kind of like some of them like in their like mid 60s, like playing what seemed to be like their first show. And it really warmed my heart. So a lot of the bands that I wasn't able to find that I just kind of wanted to mention as like personal favorites of these kind of like forgotten synth pop bands that have reemerged are Charisma, Psyche, Das Cabinet, Nine Circles, Casino Shanghai, Snowy Red, Blue Champagne, Trisomy 21, Linear Movement, Ceramic Hello, Dark Day, Eco, Garfwad, and Neon. There are so many more. One thing I actually have done is I made a Spotify playlist. It's like over 200 songs long, and it's all about stuff I was talking about today or just like related stuff that I haven't been able to mention. If you aren't on Spotify and if you prefer to download your things on SoulSeek, great. I'm really happy to provide a PDF of some of these bands, even some of the places where I found some information for this. You can either message me on Instagram at chickenpissandfuck, or I'm Mimi Hale on Facebook, or if you feel comfortable with it, you can just put your email in the chat. Other resources that I just kind of wanted to talk about for like finding this kind of music, because it's just like a never-ending like pile. Obviously, you know, find something, look it up on Discogs, but there's a really cool zine actually that was made by a guy called Alex Douglas. He's actually from North Vancouver. It's called Clem, the contact list of electronic music. This was published in 1986, and it's on archive.org, but I find it's a really, really good kind of like look at exactly what the electronic scene was at the time. And it has like everything from like labels, zines, various musicians, and like industry contacts and stuff. But it's just really just cool to see how much was going on, but how like we kind of only know like what seems like the canon that I was talking about at the start. Once again, obviously there's so much more that I couldn't touch on today. And then there's two YouTube channels I actually really like. One is In Depth Music and one is Drone MF. They both have like some really, really great like rare synth or goth or whatever related stuff. So yeah, I guess this concludes my presentation. I really appreciate everybody tuning in tonight, and huge props to Sasha for putting this on. It's been really fun to learn from everybody, and I can't wait to see y'all on the dance floor and in the pit. Bye.
All right. Oh my gosh. Am I still on here? Yes, I am. Alrighty. So yeah, as I said, anybody who wants the playlist, I guess if you're on Spotify, I'll just link my Spotify name. I think it's my only public playlist. I kind of got Spotify for this, so that's fun. I'll do that right now. And then, yeah, just like either if we're friends on Instagram, Facebook, whatever, just send your email to me, but I'll also take the emails from here. I'll probably send out the PDF tomorrow because I haven't made it yet. But yeah, hell yeah to SoulSeek. And I'll probably actually just keep updating this playlist because I felt like I didn't have enough time to like add things that are bangers and like go through my hard drive that is ancient and pull like off stuff from like old hidden comps and stuff like that. If anybody else is a nerd about this kind of music, like please send me stuff because it's my favorite shit. So yeah, I guess that's it. Alican is next, and we're going to try to set it up on his computer right now. So give us a sec here.
Please share a PDF, and also can't wait to see everyone on the dance floor and in the pit. Also, I realize we are already over time. We are recording. How do people feel about another presentation? If you can't stay for it, you can watch it. I tried to upload the last one to YouTube this week, but it's too long. So I'm just figuring out how to put it onto a different platform or split it up. So we're going to go on with Alican's presentation, but if you really can't watch it, it will be saved and it'll be back on the internet very shortly.
And then you full screen your video. I'll go check if this works.
Hi, I didn't see you there. My name is Dr. Alican, and I'm an associate professor in the Department of Slamology at the University of Toronto Hardcore. Welcome to my lecture on the history of hardcore punk in Toronto. The age-old question, which has united Marxist literary scholars and nerdy record collectors since the dawn of punk, goes something like this. What is the relationship between the material conditions of a place and time and the cultural production or aesthetic expression that emerge from it? How do we, for example, draw the lines of causation between the post-industrial wasteland that was Cleveland, Ohio in the mid-1990s and the savage hardcore punk of bands like H100s and Nine Shocks Terror, or between the drug violence which swept the city of Medellin, Colombia in the 1980s and the insane chaos of local ultra-metal bands such as Parabellum and Blasphemia? As Stuart Schrader writes in his excellent essay on Mexico City's Tercer Mundo, it is a peculiarity of cultural production which inhabits a sphere irreducible to the immediate socioeconomic world of its emergence that we cannot read off its characteristics from a sober analysis of that world. So in other words, while fucked up soundscapes coming from fucked up life worlds serve as wet dreams for record collectors, things don't always work out that way. Case in point, the case of Toronto, Ontario. On the surface of things, Toronto, a city cited by Marge Simpson as a home away from home on account of its cleanness and blandness, seems like a decidedly unlikely place for punk. This is, on the one hand, due to a combination of its Victorian tight-assness and Methodist piety, which about 50 years ago caused Sir Peter Ustinov to famously describe the city as New York run by the Swiss, and on the other, its more recent processes of gentrification and condoization, which sweep away lower-income populations as they transform the city into a big-box yuppie wasteland.
It's so clean and bland. I'm home.
For all its condos and Protestant work ethics, Toronto has also consistently produced some of the best hardcore punk on the planet. Since the early 2000s, bands like No Warning, Fucked Up, Career Suicide, Brutal Nights, School Jerks, Urban Blight, Shit, and Kremlin have solidified the city's reputation as something of a regional superpower on the DIY circuit. Even prior to what we might call the golden age of Toronto hardcore, however, the city has been home to a number of important, groundbreaking, and criminally underappreciated bands, which have paved the way for the city's thriving scene. DRI played 40 songs in 40 minutes at CBGB in 1984. Here's 40 years of Toronto hardcore in less than 30 minutes. Toronto's hardcore punk scene was born in the early 1980s out of the ashes of the city's once thriving punk scene of the late 70s. Toronto had been quite a hub for punk in its early years. Proto-punk legends such as the New York Dolls and Iggy and the Stooges respectively came through the town in 1973 and 1974, and the Ramones played a whopping 15 shows in the city between 1976 and 1980. The city was also a hotbed for local talent, including bands such as the Viletones, the Diodes, the Poles, the Ugly, the Senex, the Demics, Arson, Cardboard Brains, and Hamilton's Forgotten Rebels and Teenage Head. By 1980, the city's original punk scene was beginning to lose some of its flair. As the fashion-forward punks of the Queen West scene began losing their edge and moving in a progressively poppy direction, the scene became saturated with a new generation of younger punks who started using 77 punk as a pejorative and came up with slogans to distinguish themselves from the past generation, such as, "It's a state of mind, not clothes design." Toronto got its first taste of the shape of punk to come in July of 1980, when Vancouver's DOA played outside of City Hall for a rock against radiation show with the Viletones, the Demics, and Forgotten Rebels. The gig served as a showcase not only of the faster new hardcore sound, but also of the growing tensions between the edgelord nihilism of the older generation and the political leanings of the new generation. This escalated into something of a mini riot when Joey Shithead began calling out audience members for sig heiling during DOA's set, and causing them to start pelting the band with debris. Despite the crowd's whack-ass button-pushing antics, however, a seed of fast, politically minded punk was planted into the city's collective consciousness, one which grew into the city's first two hardcore bands by the end of the year, the Young Lions and Youth Youth Youth. Vinyl output was the biggest downfall of Toronto punk throughout the 70s and 80s. While many of the city's bands released a single or two in the 70s, few released a proper LP. And while 7-inch EPs largely came to define the output of hardcore bands in the 80s, few Toronto hardcore bands ever made it on vinyl, and the few that did usually released a 12-inch. The Young Lions are the perfect example of this. While the band gained a cult-like local following, it wasn't until 2009 that the beautiful transition between 70s punk and 80s hardcore they captured on their first two demo tapes and appearance on the TO Hardcore 83 comp tape made it onto wax. What they did manage to get out in their time was a belated LP that was only finished in 1986 after the members had moved on from the band, and which quite frankly sucks. While Youth 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 never released a 7-inch, their 12-inch Sin EP from 1983 is undoubtedly the most iconic relic of 80s Toronto punk. Not only does Youth 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 perfectly embody the sound of 80s Canadian hardcore, but their singer Brian Taylor recorded demo tapes for almost every local band of the era and put together the influential TO Hardcore 83 comp. Another fun fact about the band is that Youth 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 almost completely avoids swearing on the record, except for the word damn, which appears in quotation marks on the lyric sheet. Chronic Submission is another of Toronto's early greats who never made it onto wax until Hamilton Schizophrenic Records pressed their two demo tapes onto 12 inches in 2018 and 2019. The band was made up of a bunch of insane 13 and 14-year-old kids who played faster than virtually anyone in town. They were eventually offered a contract with Metal Blade Records, but gave up the band before releasing anything when they got into their late teens and realized they liked doing coke more than they liked playing punk. Direct Action can be cited as one of the first Canadian bands to play a more discharge-influenced style of hardcore, along with Montreal's Unruled. This, and their friendship with Montreal bands such as Vomit and the Zits, might have something to do with the fact that they were the only non-Montreal band to be featured on the legendary Primitive Air Raid compilation in 1984. For some bizarre reason, Oakville, Ontario, which in the 1980s was the richest town in Canada, with the highest percentage of millionaires per capita, was also a wild breeding ground for many of Toronto's best hardcore bands of the 80s. Probably the most influential of these was Negative Gain, another group of thrashing youngins who got their big break opening for JFA in 1983. After getting mailed their 1985 demo for review, Pusshead liked the band so much that he offered to release a full-length LP for the band, which became 1986's Back from the Dead. Unfortunately, the band's singer Pete Warner killed himself shortly after finishing the album, and never lived to see its release. After continuing as a three-piece for a few more years, the band broke up in the late 80s. Perhaps the most infamous group to come out of Toronto's 80s punk scene is BFG, or Bunch of Fucking Goofs. While their music is somewhat negligible, what BFG lacked in musical chops, they made up for in personality. Specifically, the personality of their charismatic singer, Crazy Steve Goof, the king of Kensington Market, who is credited for ridding the neighborhood of Nazi skinheads, has run for mayor of Toronto twice, and has been running various speakeasies around the city since the 80s. You'll still find him in Kensington on any given day of the week, drinking beer around a crowd of other punks. As in most other places in the 1980s, the bands that made up Toronto's hardcore scene were almost entirely male. The same can't be said about the city's broader punk and alternative scenes throughout the 70s and 80s, which produced phenomenal female-fronted bands such as the Poles, Martha and the Muffins, and United State. Toronto has also been cited as the birthplace of both queercore and Riot Girl, pioneered by local post-punkers Fifth Column, an all-girl band who were instrumental in both the queercore zine movement as well as in bridging the gap between the city's punk and queer scenes. In subsequent years, this would pave the way for a rich tradition of queer punk in the city, such as Will Monroe's legendary Vaseline parties in the early 2000s, and more recently, Tago Mago's bands and drag nights at the now-defunct Beaver. A notable exception to the lack of gender diversity within the Toronto hardcore scene, and perhaps the strangest and most mysterious band from the city, is NJF. Almost nothing is known about this elusive and short-lived Toronto outfit. They played the Queen West circuit as well as BFG's DMZ Hangout, released only one EP on a label that put out a few industrial and post-punk albums, and apparently broke up after their drummer killed himself in a suicide pact with several other people from the scene. Their name indicates that they shared a penchant for tasteless button pushing with their first-gen cohort, which is furthered by the fact that one of their members apparently had a swastika tattoo. All edgelord bullshit aside, NJF's 1984 Wounded Knee EP is possibly the best piece of wax that came out of Toronto in the 80s. The A-side features a drawn-out title track featuring a male singer and sounds like a haunting mix between gun club-esque blues punk and goth. The B-side features their female vocalist and is made up of 3 bouncy hardcore songs that clock somewhere around a minute. Probably the most bizarre moment in the band's history came some 30 years after the band ended, when Kristen Stewart was photographed at LAX wearing an NJF t-shirt, of which only 20 or 30 were ever made. For the sake of time, I'm mostly going to skip over Toronto's scene in the 90s. Unless you lived in the Bay Area or Japan, punk in the 90s was a pretty embarrassing affair. There were too many white dreads, too many joke bands, too many gym shorts, too many tribal tattoos, too many political manifestos, and too few actually good bands. Maybe this had to do with the whole punk breaking in 1991 thing, or the fact that the decade produced the best pop music since the late 60s. I don't know. Anyway, Random Killing and Brunto Crush Rock each put out a solid record in 1989. One Blood played some political hardcore. Armed and Hammered pulled off BFG's signature Kensington Market drunk punk sound with a bit more finesse. And Dirty Bird put out a surprisingly listenable EP in 1994. Oh, and then in 1998, No Warning started. Attention! TDC passengers, attention! Delay on this line! No Warning Story is another bizarre piece of Toronto hardcore folklore. The band entered the scene as a bunch of bratty teenagers from the East End who gained a kind of infamy for starting fights and talking shit. The band's career peaked in 2002 when they released their first full-length, Ill Blood, a monumental album which sparked a widespread suburban revival of Madball and Biohazard-inspired tough guy hardcore. Interestingly enough, No Warning never toured on Ill Blood, and instead got picked up by Sum 41 manager Greg Norrie of Treble Charger fame. Over the next few years, the band found themselves flying around the world, touring with the likes of Korn, Snoop Dogg, Ghostface Killah, Less Than Jake, and Papa Roach, doing wild amounts of cocaine, and released a new metal album called Suffer Survive on Linkin Park's record label in 2004. The band broke up a year later, and their singer Ben Cook later ended up playing guitar and fucked up. The 2000s are where things really start to heat up. Early on in the decade, bands like Fucked Up, Career Suicide, Brutal Nights, and Terminal State laid down the blueprints for a local sound that would spread like wildfire over the course of the next 2 decades, spawning countless new bands around the city. Fucked Up is undoubtedly the best-known hardcore band to come out of Toronto. Formed in 2001, the band almost immediately began releasing a long series of quasi-mysterious, aesthetically sharp 7-inch singles. While Fucked Up has since become an internationally recognized indie band of sorts, whose sound very much exceeds the limited parameters of hardcore punk, the band's early singles, such as No Passaran, Police, Dangerous Fumes, and Generation, very much embody what would come to characterize Toronto hardcore in the 2000s and into the following decade. A tight and almost anthemically catchy spin on classic 80s American hardcore punk. Career Suicide was born around the same time as Fucked Up, and features Fucked Up drummer Jonah Falco on guitar. Career Suicide sound is similar to Fucked Up's, with a touch more of a snotty KBD influence. This makes for some extremely catchy tracks, perhaps most notably Quarantined, off their 2003 SARS EP, which feels more relevant today than ever. Brutal Nights added a twist to the 2000s Toronto hardcore formula with a deep injection of garage rock and some laugh-out-loud lyrics from vocalist and stand-up comedian Nick Flanagan. Notable highlights include Fuck You, I Buy Sushi With My Welfare Money, My Eyes.see an item stomach want to do, Someone Named Me Is Hungry for a Chicken Food, and the following. I wake up in the morning and use wasabi mouthwash. I have an extreme lifestyle. My attitude is mosh. While never receiving the same international attention as the aforementioned bands, Terminal State's 2005 Your Rules EP very much captures the sound and feel of 2000s Toronto hardcore, feeling like it came straight out of Reagan America. It's hard to try to even summarize Toronto's hardcore output after 2005 because there is a lot, and so much of it is excellent. For the sake of convenience, I will divide this into 2 broad periods. What both of these periods share in common is exponential growth in the city's band count, in shows being held in DIY houses and DIY spaces, and more diversity in the folks who made up the scene. The first of these periods is roughly between 2005 and 2011, centered mainly around the DIY space Siesta Nouveau, and characterized by the rapid formation of new local bands and the entry of several waves of younger punks into the scene. By the second period, from 2012 to present, Toronto begins to transform into something of a destination for hardcore punk, as a result of the widespread acclaim surrounding the local bands, the beginning of Not Dead Yet Fest, which kicked off in 2012, and the opening of DIY show spaces and record stores like Sheebie-Jeebies and Faith Void. The latter period was also marked by a turn from a more American hardcore-centered sound to more international punk influences. Urban Blight was a mostly straight-edge hardcore band whose 2009 More Reality EP is probably the best hardcore record of all time. The Endless Blockade played some of the truest power violence since the early 90s. Their 2008 album Primitive is a masterpiece. Reprobates played a brilliantly blistered brand of hardcore, which sounds suspiciously like Boston's Jerry's Kids. Their 2008 Stress EP was released on Richmond, Virginia's legendary No Way Records, and is an absolute gem. Mad Men was a solo project of Jonah Falco of Fucked Up and Career Suicide fame, playing lightning-fast hardcore and looking sexy in a mesh shirt. Jerks are one of my personal favorites, who took KBD snottiness to its absolute limits and sounded more like they were from the Midwest than from Toronto. Hazardous Waste were a bunch of Mississauga skaters who played some great snotty hardcore. Molested Youth was another great, fast, no-frills hardcore punk band. Bad Choice was a short-lived but legendary band that played tough as nails, oi-tinged hardcore, and featured a singer called Mike the Mosher who sounded like a drill sergeant. Their 5-song demo tape from 2009 is the stuff of local legend, and is, in my not-so-humble opinion, the greatest of all time. Purity Control was another excellent local power violence band. And, for the sake of shameless self-promotion, Total Trash were a bunch of young kids who read Kafka once and then tried to sound like Bad Choice. Other bands from this period also include Mature Situations, UTI, Bad Skin, Bored Stiff, Raw, Eating Glass, In Time, End Program, Rammer, Slaughter Strike, Attention, Fortune Teller, Burning Love, Direct Approach, and Wastoids. Shit is without a doubt the most important local band in the post-2012 period. In addition to booking most of the hardcore shows in town since the late 2000s, Shit's guitarist Greg Benedetto kicked off Not Dead Yet Fest in 2012, turning the city into a punk paradise of sorts with its eclectic and stacked lineups. The members of Shit also ran Sheebie-Jeebies, the city's most vibrant DIY space since Siesta Nouveau, and singer Ryan Tong later opened the equally important punk record store and show space, Faith Void, in 2015. In addition to their contributions to the local scene, Shit play a wildly catchy and distinct brand of hardcore that has since been imitated by many. Featuring School Jerks and Terminal State drummer Ivan Roberts Davis, Kremlin played frenetic and skeletal hardcore that bridges the riffy D-beating of Swedish hardcore with the raw animal energy of its Finnish counterpart. The influence of Swedish D-beat is also very present in the songs of Absolute, but blown the fuck out and taken over the edge with some gnarly metallic guitars shredding right through it. Coining the term power beat to refer to their sound, Triage played some wild crossover with a crusty vibe that feels reminiscent of 80s Japanese metal punk. Featuring a Colombian singer and lyrics in Spanish, Gaucho played some mean Latino-style raw punk. In a more American hardcore punk vein, Spearhead, Chlorine, and Pedestrian released some excellent demo tapes, as did the ultra-mysterious Home Invasion. Other bands from this period also include Cunt Punt, Mullet, The Boys, Violent Future, Tash Me, The Frags, Hassler, Valley Boys, FLQ, Pure Pressure, Wrong Generation, Spore, Anti-Vibes, and Burial Permit. So there you have it, folks. I hope that this presentation has instilled you with a connoisseurship for the fine delicacy that is hardcore punk from Toronto. Keep on rocking in the free world.
I don't know. Hey, thanks, y'all.
Yeah.
That was very sick. I want to see a show so bad now after all of these presentations. And thank you all for staying for this extra long episode of Rock and Roll High School. Next week, we are going to have Martin doing a non-Punisher overview of power violence, Sameo doing an overview of Japanese raw punk, and Rhiannon doing a workshop on patchmaking. So that's all we have for this week. Thank you all so much. See you next week.